The cruelest price a daughter can pay is the one named devotion. On the last night Clara Whitmore belonged to herself. The house was so cold she could see her own breath drifting over the teacup in her hands, pale as a ghost above cracked porcelain. The wind pressed against the windows as though winter itself had come to listen, and from the parlor beyond the half-closed door, her father's voice fell into the silence with the hard, dull sound of a coin dropped on wood. "She will go," he said. "She understands what must be done." Clara did not move. For one suspended second, she thought perhaps he spoke of someone else, some other unfortunate girl hidden in the shadows of that small house, some other daughter raised on excuses and unpaid promises. But there was no other girl. There was only Clara, standing in her faded blue dress with the hem carefully mended twice over, one hand wrapped around a cup that no longer gave warmth, listening as her future was negotiated like a thing with no heartbeat. The gentleman who had come to collect the debt did not sound cruel. That was what made it worse. Cruelty, at least, had edges. His voice was smooth, almost bored, as he explained that the arrangement was respectable, that the position had been secured through noble connections, that she would serve as a lady's companion at Ashford Hall until the matter of her father's obligations was considered settled. Lady's companion. The phrase was wrapped in silk, but Clara heard the iron beneath it. It meant she was being sent away so that a man who had gambled too often and failed too easily could continue breathing without shame, while she carried all of it in his place. When her father opened the door and saw her standing there, he had the decency to look tired, though not the decency to look ashamed. "Clara," he said softly, as if gentleness could cleanse what he had done. "You know I would never ask this if there were another way." She looked at the lines in his face, the tremor in his hands, the ruin he wore like a wound given to him by fate instead of one carved by his own choices. And for the first time in her life, pity did not come. Something colder did. Something clean. "No," she said, quietly. "There was always another way. It simply was never one that cost you." He flinched, but only for a moment. By dawn, her trunk stood by the front door, small enough to shame her, containing 2 plain dresses, a Bible with her mother's name written inside, and a ribbon the color of old roses. The carriage waiting outside was black, elegant, and silent, with polished wheels already dusted in frost. No neighbor came to wave goodbye. No one wished her well. The street itself seemed to turn away. Clara stepped inside without help, because she would not allow the last piece of herself to be carried too. As the carriage rolled forward, the little house vanished behind the veil of morning mist, and with it the girl who had once believed sacrifice was a kind of love. Ashford Hall stood nearly 60 miles away, beyond fields stripped bare by the season and villages still asleep under a gray sky. And somewhere at the end of that long frozen road waited a duke she had never met, a man powerful enough to buy debts as easily as candles, a man people spoke of in lowered voices, as though even his name preferred darkness. Clara pressed her gloved fingers together and stared out at the winter earth rushing past. She had been told she was going there to serve. She had been told it was honorable. She had been told she was saving her family. But deep in the hollow, trembling quiet of her chest, another truth had already begun to rise. She was not being sent to a new life. She was being delivered to a secret. And before the sun set, Clara Whitmore would learn that the Duke of Ashford had not paid for her obedience at all. He had paid for something far more dangerous, her freedom. By the time the carriage reached the outer gates of Ashford Hall, the day had already surrendered its weak winter light, and the world beyond the glass had turned the color of cold steel. Clara had never seen a place so large that it seemed less like a house than a judgment. The iron gates opened without a sound, and the carriage rolled forward between rows of bare trees whose branches arched overhead like dark hands in prayer. Frost silvered the gravel. Tall windows glimmered in the distance, lit from within by 100 steady lamps, and above them all the house rose in solemn stone, vast and pale, its towers blurred by the last thin veil of evening mist. It should have looked welcoming, perhaps even grand. Instead it looked watchful. Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gloves still on though her fingers had long since gone numb. Every mile had given her too much time to think and none at all to breathe. She had imagined many things during that journey. A stern old woman demanding cheerful conversation. A household of servants who would know instantly why she had come. A future measured in polite humiliation. What she had not imagined was the strange hush that fell over the grounds, as though the house itself had been expecting her. When the carriage stopped beneath the front portico, a servant in dark livery opened the door and bowed with perfect correctness. No curiosity touched his face. No pity. That, too, unsettled her. She stepped down carefully, the hem of her dress brushing the stone, and the cold struck her at once, sharp enough to make her inhale. Ashford Hall smelled of winter and polished wood, and something faintly older, like old books kept closed too long. Inside, the entrance hall stretched upward into shadows and candlelight. Black and white marble spread beneath her worn boots. A staircase curved toward the upper floor like the sweep of a noblewoman's hand. Portraits lined the walls, all solemn eyes and aristocratic silence, and Clara felt them take her in at once. Her plain coat, her small trunk, her careful stillness. She had entered places before where she did not belong. Never one that seemed to know it before she did. A woman in a dark gray gown approached with measured grace. Her face was kind, though carefully composed, and her silver hair was pinned so neatly it seemed untouched by time. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "I am Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper. You must be tired after 60 miles on the road." Clara inclined her head. "Thank you." Mrs. Ellis's gaze lingered on her only a second longer, as if confirming something to herself. "Not weakness. Not beauty. Endurance, perhaps. His Grace has been informed of your arrival," she said. "You will be shown to your room, and dinner will be sent if you wish it." His Grace. The words settled coldly. Clara had spent the whole journey thinking of the Duke of Ashford as an idea, a distant and powerful name attached to a debt she could not escape. Hearing him reduced to title alone made him seem stranger still, less a man than a force already moving through the walls around her. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a sound crossed the hall behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, only the measured strike of a cane against marble, followed by the quiet rhythm of footsteps that did not hurry because nothing in this world had ever required them to. Clara turned. He stood at the far end of the hall beneath the high, burnished glow of a chandelier, dressed in black so severe it might have been mistaken for mourning, if not for the authority in the way he wore it. Duke Sebastian Ashford was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered, still as carved stone, with dark hair touched by the candlelight, and a face so composed it gave nothing away. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray and cold and sharp enough to make every thought inside her feel suddenly visible. He did not smile. He did not look surprised. He looked at her as though he had been waiting for this precise moment, and found it neither better nor worse than he had imagined. Clara felt the heat rise beneath her skin, not from embarrassment alone, but from the unbearable knowledge that he knew. He knew why she had come. He knew what price had brought her there. He knew, and still he looked at her not with contempt, but with something far more disquieting. Recognition. Then his gaze lowered, briefly, to the small trunk at her feet, to the frayed seam near her sleeve, and back to her face. "Miss Whitmore," he said at last, his voice deep and calm, carrying easily through the hall. "Welcome to Ashford." No one had ever spoken the word welcome to her in such a tone before, as though it were not comfort, but consequence. Clara forced herself to answer. "Your Grace." That was all. It was all her pride could trust. For one suspended instant neither of them moved. Then the Duke inclined his head with grave formality, turned, and disappeared into the western corridor without another word. The silence he left behind felt fuller than speech. Mrs. Ellis drew a breath Clara had not heard her holding. "Come," the housekeeper said softly. "Your room is prepared." Clara followed her toward the staircase, but her pulse had changed, quick and unsteady beneath her ribs. She had expected disdain. She had expected indifference. What she had seen instead in the Duke's eyes was something quieter and far more dangerous, as if he had not purchased a burden to be managed, but recognized a wound he already understood. And before Clara reached the first landing, she knew with sudden certainty that Ashford Hall was hiding more than wealth, more than rank, more than the solemn dignity of old stone and older blood. Somewhere within those walls was the truth of why a man like Sebastian Ashford had paid her father's debt. And whatever that truth was, it had begun long before her carriage ever reached his door. Her room was larger than the entire upper floor of the house Clara had left behind, and that alone felt like an insult dressed as comfort. A fire had already been lit in the grate, low and steady, casting amber light over paneled walls, a narrow writing desk, and a bed draped in dark velvet that seemed made for some other woman. Some woman born to silk sheets and silver brushes and the quiet certainty of belonging. Clara stood just inside the door while the maid who had carried up her trunk withdrew with a polite curtsy, leaving her alone in a stillness so complete she could hear the faint crackle of the fire and, somewhere beyond the tall windows, the winter wind moving through the bare trees. For a long moment, she did not remove her gloves. She did not sit. She did not touch anything. It was easier to think of herself as a visitor than to admit she had been placed there, arranged like one more object inside a house that had already decided what she was. On the dressing table stood a porcelain basin filled with steaming water. Beside it lay a folded towel, thick and white and far softer than any cloth Clara had owned. There was even a ribbon, ivory instead of rose, set carefully beside a comb of polished tortoiseshell. The sight of such small thoughtfulness should have soothed her. Instead it made her throat tighten. Kindness could be more dangerous than cruelty when one did not know its cost. She crossed the room at last and touched the back of the chair near the hearth, then the smooth carved edge of the mantel, as if testing whether any of it were real. Beneath the firelight, her own reflection in the mirror startled her. Her face looked paler than usual, her eyes too large, her hair loosened by the long journey into soft, disordered waves around her temples. She looked exactly like what she was, a respectable girl placed in an extraordinary house for reasons no respectable girl should ever have had to bear. A knock sounded at the door, light and measured. Clara turned so quickly her skirt brushed the rug. "Come in," she said. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying a small tray with tea, bread, and a bowl of clear broth. "You have not eaten since morning, I think," the housekeeper said. "That is too long for any lady, companion, or otherwise." The last words were spoken calmly, but Clara heard them. Companion or otherwise. So Mrs. Ellis knew there were other names for what had brought her here. Clara lowered her eyes. "You are very kind." "Kindness has little to do with it," Mrs. Ellis replied, setting the tray near the fire. "This house runs on order. Hungry people are rarely able to preserve it." Yet there was no unkindness in her tone. She glanced around the room once, then back at Clara. "Lady Beatrice does not receive visitors after sunset. You will meet her tomorrow morning. Until then, you may rest." Clara hesitated. "Lady Beatrice is His Grace's aunt. His father's sister." Mrs. Ellis folded her hands. "She has not been well for some time, though her mind remains sharper than most people find convenient." A faint, almost private expression touched the older woman's mouth, then vanished. Clara took a breath. The question had been pressing against her since the hall below, impossible to silence. "Why was I chosen?" Mrs. Ellis looked at her with a steadiness that made evasion useless. "I am not at liberty to speak for His Grace." "Then speak for yourself." The words escaped before Clara could soften them. She ought to have apologized. She knew that. But the long road, the great house, the calm precision of every gesture around her had worn her nerves to something bright and thin. "Please," she said more quietly, "I do not ask for gossip. I only wish to know whether I was brought here for what was told to me, or for something else." Mrs. Ellis was silent long enough for the fire to shift and settle. "Miss Whitmore," she said at last, "there are many ways a young woman in difficulty may be sent into a noble household, and not all of them are merciful. You would do well to remember that." Clara felt the room grow colder despite the flames. "That is not an answer." "No," said the housekeeper gently. "It is a warning." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "His Grace is not a man who explains himself quickly, but he does not act without reason. In this house, that has always mattered more than charm." When she had gone, Clara remained standing beside the untouched tray, listening to the silence settle over the room once more. Not a man who explains himself quickly. She believed that already. The Duke had said so little, yet his presence still seemed to linger in the chamber like the trace of cold air after a door had closed. Clara crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. Below, the front drive lay washed in moonlight, pale against the dark grounds, and farther off the black line of trees stood motionless beneath the winter sky. One window in the western wing still glowed. She did not know why she was certain it was his. Perhaps because it was the only light that did not seem merely warm. It seemed wakeful, watching. Her fingers tightened on the curtain. Somewhere in this vast and silent place, a man she had met for less than a minute held the truth of her future in his hands. Yet for the first time since leaving home, Clara sensed something stranger than fear rising slowly within her. Not hope. Hope was too soft for such a night. It was curiosity sharpened by instinct, the uneasy certainty that the bargain carrying her name had not begun with money at all. And as the fire burned lower and the house sank deeper into its solemn midnight hush, Clara understood one thing with perfect clarity. She had not been brought to Ashford Hall by accident. She had been expected. Morning entered Ashford Hall without tenderness. It came pale and silver through the tall windows, laying a cold sheen across the marble floors and the long corridors where every footstep seemed to belong to someone more certain than Clara Whitmore. She had slept only in fragments, drifting in and out beneath the heavy coverlet, while the fire burned low and the unfamiliar silence of the house pressed softly at the walls. More than once she thought she heard movement beyond her door, the distant opening of another chamber, the muted sound of servants already at work below, and each time she woke with the same thought waiting for her like a hand at her throat. She was still here. Whatever had happened on the road, whatever bargain had been made over her life without her consent, the morning had not undone it. A maid arrived just after 8 with hot water and a dark green day dress laid neatly over one arm. It was simple by the standards of the house, but finer than anything Clara had owned, with a high collar, fitted sleeves, and a row of pearl buttons that caught the light with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Ellis asked that this be brought to you, miss," the girl said. "Lady Beatrice prefers her companions dressed plainly, but well." Companions. The word settled uneasily. Clara thanked her, then stood for a long moment looking at the dress before she put it on. It fit too well. Not perfectly, but well enough to suggest that someone had known her measurements with disturbing accuracy, or had guessed them with the sort of care that required prior thought. When she was ready, she pinned back her hair with steady fingers and descended the staircase alone, one gloved hand resting lightly on the banister polished by generations before her. The morning room lay at the eastern end of the house, flooded with a softer light than the entrance hall had offered the night before. Here the grandeur of Ashford Hall withdrew slightly, making room for warmth. Shelves of books lined the walls. A pianoforte stood near the windows. Fresh flowers, winter white and delicate as paper, had been arranged in low vases across the mantel. And in a wing-back chair near the hearth sat Lady Beatrice Ashford, wrapped in a shawl the color of smoke, one hand resting over the silver head of her cane. She was older than Clara had imagined, though not frail in the way illness often made people. There was a thinness to her, yes, and a certain carefulness in the way she moved, but her face retained something keen and commanding beneath its age, and her eyes, a faded blue still bright with intelligence, lifted to Clara with such directness that the younger woman felt immediately examined. "So," Lady Beatrice said, before any servant could announce her, "my nephew has finally done something impulsive and called it practical." Clara stopped 3 feet inside the room, unsure whether to bow, speak, or pretend she had not heard the dry edge beneath the words. Before she could decide, the older woman motioned to the chair opposite her. "Sit down, child. If you stand there looking stricken, I shall be forced to pity you, and I dislike beginning any acquaintance with pity." The sentence was so unexpected that Clara almost smiled. Almost. She crossed the room and sat as invited, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I hope I may be of use to you, my lady." Lady Beatrice studied her for another moment. "That depends entirely on whether you can read aloud without murdering poetry, play cards without cheating, and answer honestly when spoken to." Clara lowered her gaze for the briefest second. "I can read well enough. I do not cheat, and I have learned that honesty is not always welcome." "No," Lady Beatrice said, "but it is often refreshing." A maid poured tea and withdrew. The room grew still again. Clara sensed, rather than saw, that this first conversation mattered more than appearances would admit. Lady Beatrice was not merely deciding whether she liked her. She was measuring her, perhaps against some expectation already formed by others. "Tell me," the older woman said, stirring nothing into her tea though she held the spoon poised above the cup. "Did my nephew explain why you were brought here?" Clara met her eyes. There it was. Not if. Why? No, my lady. Lady Beatrice gave a quiet sound that might have been amusement or irritation. Of course he did not. Sebastian has always mistaken silence for virtue when in truth it is only a habit grown too elegant to challenge. She sipped her tea, then set the cup aside. You are here to keep me company, yes. That part is true. I am old, I am difficult, and the household grows tedious when one is no longer permitted to climb stairs merely to alarm the staff. But that is not the whole of it. Clara felt her pulse shift. Then what is the whole of it? The older woman leaned back, the morning light catching the fine lines beside her mouth. That, she said, is what I should like to know myself. The answer, strange as it was, felt more honest than any comfort might have. Clara drew a slow breath. You did not ask for me. No. Yet his grace brought me here. Yes. And no one will tell me why. Lady Beatrice's gaze sharpened with sudden sympathy, though she was too proud a woman to soften it fully. My dear, in this house there are truths my nephew keeps as other men keep loaded pistols. Close. Hidden. Dangerous mostly to himself. Before Clara could respond, movement in the doorway altered the very air. She did not need to turn at once to know who had entered. Some presences announced themselves not by sound, but by gravity. Duke Sebastian Ashford stood at the threshold in morning black, one hand gloved, the other resting lightly at his side, his expression unreadable beneath the pale light. His eyes moved first to his aunt, then to Clara, and paused there just long enough to make the room seem smaller than it was. I trust, he said evenly, that my household has managed not to terrify Miss Whitmore before breakfast. Lady Beatrice lifted her cup again with regal indifference. Not before breakfast, no. After breakfast remains to be seen. Clara rose at once. Your Grace. He inclined his head, but his gaze remained on her with that same unsettling exactness, as though every detail she had tried to arrange into calm had been noticed anyway. The neat collar, the gloved hands, the effort. Miss Whitmore, he said, I hope you found your room comfortable. Yes, Your Grace. And the journey has done you no lasting harm. None worth naming. For the first time, something flickered at the edge of his expression, not quite approval, not quite surprise. Then it was gone. Good, he said. Because before this day is over, there are several things you deserve to know, and I would prefer you hear them from me. For one suspended heartbeat, no one in the morning. Room moved. Even the fire seemed to draw inward, its soft crackle subdued beneath the weight of the Duke's final words. Clara remained standing beside her chair, one hand lightly touching the carved wood at its back, as though the steady shape of it might keep her own composure from shifting. Several things you deserve to know. The sentence should have offered relief. Instead, it unsettled her more deeply than silence had, because truth, when it finally came, had the power to destroy the little order one had managed to build around uncertainty. Lady Beatrice regarded her nephew over the rim of her teacup with an expression that mixed long familiarity with faint displeasure. A remarkable sentiment, she said. One might almost think honesty had at last found its way into this house. Sebastian Ashford did not glance at his aunt. His eyes stayed on Clara, calm and unreadable, and in that unwavering attention there was something curiously formal, as if he were not merely addressing her, but granting her a place he had already decided she possessed. Walk with me after breakfast, Miss Whitmore, he said. There is a conservatory at the south end of the east wing. It is warm there, and private. Private. The word entered the room softly and altered it at once. Clara felt the faintest tightening in her chest, not from impropriety, but from the knowledge that privacy inside a great house could hold either mercy or danger, and one did not always know which until the door had closed. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then raised them again. As you wish, Your Grace. He gave the slightest nod, and only then did the tension in the room ease by a degree she could almost measure. Lady Beatrice set down her cup with deliberate care. Do not look so grave, child, she said to Clara, though her gaze rested briefly on her nephew. Sebastian was born grave. It is one of the burdens his title imposed upon the rest of us. Something very near weariness touched the Duke's mouth, but vanished before it could become a smile. You overstate the tragedy, Aunt. Do I? She returned. Your face has not changed since the age of 12. Clara might have been amused in any other circumstance. Instead, she became newly aware of how unusual this exchange was, how little it resembled the rigid household she had imagined. Lady Beatrice did not fear the Duke. She challenged him with a familiarity sharpened by affection, and he accepted it without irritation. That alone contradicted part of the man Clara had been prepared to meet. Breakfast proceeded with an outward calm that did nothing to quiet the thoughts gathering beneath it. Lady Beatrice asked Clara whether she preferred Milton or Tennyson. Clara answered carefully, and was rewarded by a brisk discourse on the weakness of modern sentiment. A footman refilled cups. Sunlight shifted slowly across the carpet. And through it all, Sebastian remained near the window, taking little more than coffee, speaking rarely, yet seeming to observe everything. More than once Clara felt his gaze on her when she was not looking at him directly, and each time the sensation was the same, not intrusive, not possessive, but exacting, as though he were determined to learn what sort of strength had been hidden beneath a plain dress and a ruined household. It was an intolerable thing to be studied so closely by the man who had purchased the right to alter her fate. When the meal at last ended, Lady Beatrice extended her hand to Clara, allowing the younger woman to help her rise. "Do not let him speak to you as though he were delivering orders from Sinai," the older woman murmured, low enough that only Clara could hear. "He is capable of plain speech when sufficiently pressed." Clara barely had time to absorb this before Sebastian crossed the room. He offered his aunt a courteous inclination of the head. "I have instructed Mrs. Ellis to send for Dr. Mercer at noon. Your cough returned last night." "My cough returns whenever the weather is dull and my nephew becomes overbearing," Lady Beatrice replied. "So nearly every day?" Yet there was warmth beneath it. She turned to Clara. "Go on, child. Better to have answers than imagination. Imagination makes prisons look larger." Then she released Clara's hand and moved slowly toward the door with her cane and maid beside her. The room seemed to empty around their departure. For the first time since entering Ashford Hall, Clara found herself alone with Duke Sebastian Ashford. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was worse. It was deliberate. He crossed to the mantel, resting one gloved hand against the marble, and for a moment he looked not at her, but into the fire, as though arranging his thoughts in some order she could not yet see. Then he turned. Morning light caught the hard lines of his face, the dark severity of his coat, the pale scar just visible near his temple that she had not noticed the night before. It did not mar him. It only made him seem more real, and therefore more dangerous. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "before I explain why you are here, I must ask you for one thing." Clara held herself still. "What is that?" His eyes met hers with a steadiness that made every evasive answer impossible before it was even formed. "That you listen to everything," he said, "before deciding whether to hate me." Clara did not answer at once. The words remained between them, quiet and sharp, as though the Duke had set something fragile and dangerous upon a table and asked her not to break it before seeing its shape. Hate me. He had not said mistrust. He had not said judge. He had chosen the harsher word, and that choice unsettled her more than any polished evasion could have done. Most powerful men preferred to be misunderstood in flattering ways. They called control duty, concealment discretion, and coldness restraint. But Sebastian Ashford had spoken as though he knew exactly what place he might hold in her thoughts, and did not intend to hide from it. "Very well," Clara said at last, each syllable steady because she would not let him hear the uncertainty beneath it. "I will listen." For a moment he simply regarded her, and she had the strange impression that she had passed some private measure she had not known was being taken. Then he moved toward the open doors leading from the morning room, and with a slight gesture invited her to walk ahead of him. The conservatory lay beyond a long glass corridor warmed by weak winter sun. As Clara entered it, a different air met her at once, damp with soil, and the faint sweetness of green things kept alive against the season. Palms reached upward beneath the high arched ceiling. Climbing vines wound around white trellises. Orange trees stood in painted tubs near the windows, their leaves glossy in the light. After the solemn stone and dark wood of Ashford Hall, the space felt almost unreal, like a memory of summer trapped inside glass. Sebastian closed the door behind them, and the soft click of the latch made the quiet seem deeper. "You were told," he began, "that your father's debts were transferred to my estate in exchange for your service here." Clara turned to face him fully. Yes, that is true, but incomplete. He removed one glove, not with nervousness, but with the air of a man preparing to speak plainly at last. His bare hand rested lightly against the back of a wicker chair, long fingers still, strong, disciplined. 3 weeks ago your father attempted to secure a private arrangement with Lord Harwood. The name meant nothing to Clara at first. Then she searched her memory and found it, spoken once in a whisper by a neighbor, attached to carts, horses, and the sort of reputation women lowered their voices around. Something cold passed through her. I have heard the name, she said. Then you know enough. His tone did not harden, but something in it became more precise. Harwood is not a man I would willingly allow near any woman without protection, and certainly not one whose circumstances could be used against her. Clara felt the blood drain from her face so quickly that even the warm air of the conservatory could not soften it. She had known her father desperate. She had known him weak. But there are truths the mind resists until another voice gives them form. What arrangement? She asked, though some part of her already understood. Sebastian did not insult her with false innocence. An extended placement in Harwood's household, he said, under terms that would have made refusal nearly impossible once you arrived. Clara stared at him. The orange leaves behind his shoulder blurred for an instant, then sharpened again. And you know this how? Because Harwood mentioned it at my table, Sebastian replied. He spoke of it carelessly, as men often do when they believe themselves among equals. He had not yet secured the contract, but he expected little difficulty. He also expected my amusement. Clara's hands had tightened so fiercely in front of her that the knuckles beneath her gloves ached. And were you amused, Your Grace? It was a crueler question than prudence allowed, but the ground beneath her own life had shifted too suddenly for caution. The Duke's gaze did not leave hers. No, he said. Only that. No embellishment. No outrage displayed for effect. Yet the word carried a force so quiet that it struck deeper than anger might have done. He continued after a moment. I had your father's debts reviewed that same week. They were considerable, but not beyond remedy. I purchased them through an intermediary, then arranged for your position here before Harwood could proceed. Clara drew a breath that did not seem to fill her lungs. So you interfered? Yes. Without asking me. Yes. And then had me brought here under a title that made the transaction appear respectable. Yes. He answered every charge without defense, and the honesty of it made her almost furious. You speak as if I should be grateful. No, for the first time something changed in his face, not softness, but a grave fatigue, as though he had replayed this conversation a dozen times before it ever occurred. I speak as a man who chose the only path that would reach you before he did. The conservatory seemed suddenly too warm. Clara turned away, taking 2 steps toward the nearest window, where the winter grounds lay pale beyond the glass. Her reflection looked back at her faintly among the leaves, a woman dressed with care, standing in a duke's hidden garden, learning that her life had been passed from one man's bargain to another's intervention like a sealed letter. You had no right, she said quietly. No. Sebastian answered behind her. I had none. She closed her eyes for one brief second. Then why did you do it? There was a pause, not long, but deep enough to make her heart beat harder in the silence. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, losing none of its control, and yet carrying something more dangerous than control. Something personal. Because I have seen what becomes of women when men convince themselves that desperation gives them permission, he said. And I could not stand by while your father mistook you for a debt to be traded. Clara did not turn back to him at once. She stood before the glass with the winter grounds spread pale and distant beyond it, her own reflection suspended faintly among the leaves and branches kept alive beneath the conservatory roof. The air smelled of damp earth and citrus, of cultivated warmth, and yet she felt colder than she had on the road. To Ashford Hall. A part of her wanted to seize the nearest sharp thing and cut through the entire conversation until only one truth remained. He had taken control of her life without her permission. Another part, quieter and far more dangerous, understood that if he had not done so, another man might have done far worse under the protection of legality and polite society. It was not gratitude she felt. Gratitude would have been simple. This was something more painful because it refused to settle into a single shape. You speak, she said at last, keeping her gaze on the frost beyond the glass. as though rescue excuses possession. Behind her, Sebastian did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried no offense. It does not. Clara turned then, slowly, and found him standing where she had left him, one hand resting against the wicker chair, the morning light striking the severe lines of his face and making his gray eyes seem almost silver. He looked exactly like a man born to command, and perhaps that was what angered her most. Even his honesty came clothed in authority. "Then tell me plainly what I am here to be," she said. "Not what the arrangement says. Not what your household believes. What am I to you, your grace?" The question entered the warm stillness and remained there. She watched him receive it without flinching. That, too, she was beginning to understand about him. He did not retreat from difficult truths. He simply stood before them until they yielded. "You are not here to belong to anyone," he said at last. "You are here because this was the only house in which I could ensure your safety without provoking scandal strong enough to trap you elsewhere." Clara gave a soft, incredulous breath that was not laughter. "Safety can be another name for confinement." "Yes," he said. "I know." Something in those two words changed the air between them. Not because they solved anything, but because they did not come from abstraction. They came from experience. Clara searched his face with new attention and saw again what she had only glimpsed before, not merely coldness, not merely discipline, but the marks of a private history held too tightly for ease. "And how long," she asked, "am I expected to remain under your protection?" The faintest shadow passed through his expression. "Until your father's accounts are settled and there is no legal claim by which he, or anyone acting through him, may force your dependence elsewhere." "That is not a measure of time." "No, it could be months. Possibly. Or longer. If necessary." She looked at him in disbelief. "And you imagine I will accept that?" "I imagine," he said quietly, "that you may reject it with every reason in your favor. But rejection will not alter the facts. At present, Ashford Hall is the one place where your name can remain unspoiled while your future is rebuilt." The words should have sounded arrogant. Instead, they landed with the heavy precision of strategy already laid in motion. Clara hated that part of her recognized the truth in them. A woman could endure hunger. She could endure work. What the world rarely forgave was rumor. Once whispered into the wrong drawing room, it could follow her farther than poverty ever had. She took a slow breath, then another. "So this is your bargain," she said. "I remain here, serve your aunt, smile when spoken to, and in return you manage the ruins my father left behind." "No." The answer came so swiftly that it startled her. Sebastian stepped away from the chair then, closing some of the space between them, though not enough to threaten. "That is the arrangement. It is not the bargain." Clara's pulse shifted. "Then what is?" His gaze held hers with a steadiness almost impossible to bear. "That while you are in this house, no decision concerning your future will be made without your knowledge again." For the first time since entering the conservatory, silence did not feel like a weapon. It felt like the edge of one being lowered. Clara stared at him, uncertain whether she had heard mercy or merely a more elegant form of control. "You expect me to trust that promise?" "No," he said. "I expect you to test it." The answer struck somewhere deeper than persuasion could have reached. She should have resisted it. She should have remembered every reason not to be moved by a man who commanded wealth, servants, land, and the outcome of her father's debts with the turn of his hand. Yet there was nothing careless in Sebastian Ashford, nothing self-congratulatory, nothing of the rescuer pleased by his own virtue. If anything, he looked like a man burdened by action, rather than proud of it. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but to gather the fragments of herself into something steady. When she looked up again, the sharpest edge of her anger had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer blind. "Very well," she said. "I will stay for now. I will attend Lady Beatrice. I will hear what must be heard and see what must be seen. But do not mistake necessity for surrender, your grace." Something almost imperceptible moved in his expression then, not a smile, but the shadow of respect. "I would not dare, Miss Whitmore." And though the words were simple, Clara understood in that moment that the true danger of Ashford Hall did not lie in being trapped there. It lay in how quickly one began to sense that the coldest man in it had no wish to break her spirit at all. He wished only to stand between it and the world. And that was the kind of protection a woman could come to need before she ever intended to trust it. The days that followed settled over Ashford Hall with a strange, measured grace, and Clara soon discovered that comfort could wound as sharply as cruelty when one had not chosen it. Each morning a fresh dress appeared in her room, always modest, always elegant, always fitting just well enough to remind her that someone had considered her place in the house before she herself had understood it. Her meals arrived warm. Her fire was kept lit. Her duties with Lady Beatrice were neither humiliating nor difficult. She read aloud in the afternoons, played cards by the window while the older woman delivered ruthless judgments on poets, politicians, and distant cousins, and accompanied her through the East Gallery when the weather pressed too heavily on her lungs for the garden paths. Nothing in her days was harsh. That was the cruelty of it. No one at Ashford Hall treated Clara like a burden. No one spoke to her with open contempt. Yet beneath every polished courtesy lived the same unspoken truth. She had not come there by invitation, but by purchase. It was in the way certain servants paused just half a second too long before addressing her, uncertain whether to grant her the deference due a lady or the practicality due a dependent. It was in the fine gloves left on her dressing table, the books placed in her sitting room, the quiet assumption that she would stay because where else could she go? Even kindness, when it arrived too early and cost too much, could feel like another form of debt. Lady Beatrice, at least, spared her pretense. "You look as if the wallpaper has insulted your pride," the older woman observed one afternoon while Clara turned the pages of a novel she had not truly been reading. "Has the house offended you again?" Clara lowered the book. The winter light across the carpet was pale as watered silk, and beyond the tall windows the sky lay low and colorless over the grounds. "The house has done nothing, my lady." "Which is precisely the difficulty, I suspect." Lady Beatrice adjusted the shawl at her shoulders. "One may defend oneself against open hostility. Gratitude is the harder cage." Clara said nothing, because the older woman had struck too cleanly for denial. After a moment, Lady Beatrice's expression softened by a degree. "My nephew has many faults," she said, "but he does not confuse possession with care. Remember that when this place begins to trouble you." Clara tried to remember it. She tried when she walked through corridors lined with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to ask what right she had to pass beneath them. She tried when Sebastian appeared at dinner with that same grave composure and inquired after his aunt's health, Clara's comfort, the weather, the doctor's recommendation, all with the careful civility of a man determined to give nothing that might be mistaken for intrusion. He never lingered too near her chair, never touched her hand when taking a cup from the footman beside her, never addressed her with intimacy disguised as kindness. Yet he noticed everything. Once, when she admitted she had not slept well, a maid brought lavender to her room that evening. Another time, when Lady Beatrice complained that the sun in the West Gallery was too harsh on Clara's eyes at that hour, the curtains had been altered by the next day. No explanation was offered. None was needed. His influence moved through the house like a current beneath still water, rarely seen, always felt. That evening, guests arrived for supper, 2 neighboring gentlewomen and a widowed magistrate, whose conversation smelled faintly of approval. Clara had been warned only an hour before, and though Mrs. Ellis assured her she was under no obligation to remain if she felt unprepared, withdrawal would have looked too much like shame. So she entered the drawing room in a soft gray gown with her head held steady, reminding herself that dignity was often no more than quiet endurance made visible. Introductions were made. Polite remarks exchanged. Tea poured. At first the conversation flowed around her without injury, but Clara had learned that danger in refined houses rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived smiling. "Miss Whitmore has been such a blessing to dear Lady Beatrice already," said Mrs. Ellingford, a woman whose pearls seemed almost as sharp as her eyes. How fortunate his grace was to secure someone so suitable on such short notice. The room did not change outwardly. No cup paused in midair. No voice faltered. Yet Clara felt the sentence for what it was, a needle slipped neatly beneath silk. On such short notice. Secure. Suitable. Terms for a servant, a purchase, a convenience. Clara kept her face still. "Lady Beatrice has shown me more generosity than I can repay," she said. Mrs. Ellingford smiled. "Oh, my dear, in houses such as this, usefulness is often the best repayment." The words landed softly. That was what made them sting. Clara felt the old heat rise under her skin, the same helpless humiliation that had followed her from her father's parlor to this house of marble and candlelight. For one terrible instant she feared Sebastian might intervene, and that would have been worse, to be defended like something fragile before strangers who already suspected the terms of her arrival. But he did not speak. He stood near the mantel in evening black, one hand resting lightly against its carved edge, and his expression revealed nothing. Clara despised him for that silence. She despised herself even more for searching his face anyway. So she lifted her chin and answered before anyone else could fill the pause. "Then I hope to remain of uncommon use, Mrs. Ellingford," she said quietly, "since I have found this house values service more honorably than some others value breeding." The magistrate coughed into his cup. One of the other ladies lowered her eyes. Lady Beatrice's cane tapped once against the carpet in unmistakable satisfaction, and only then did Clara allow herself to look at the Duke. He had not moved. He had not smiled. But in his gray eyes, cold and steady beneath the candlelight, she saw something she had not expected to find there. Not triumph, not amusement, respect, and it unsettled her far more than insult ever could. The drawing room did not recover at once. It settled instead into the delicate stillness that follows a remark too sharp to be ignored and too polished to be condemned. Clara kept her hands folded loosely in her lap, though she could feel the quickened pulse in her wrists, and forced herself to lower her gaze to the untouched tea beside her as though nothing in the room had altered. But everything had. Mrs. Ellingford, who had expected either embarrassment or retreat, smiled with a care so precise it almost counted as defeat. The magistrate began speaking of county roads with determined enthusiasm. One of the other ladies murmured something agreeable about the weather. And through it all, Lady Beatrice reclined with the expression of a general who had just watched an untested soldier survive her first battle without dropping the sword. It was not until supper ended and the guests had begun their slow procession toward cloaks and carriages that the second wound was delivered. Clara had excused herself to the gallery outside the drawing room under the pretense of seeking fresh air, though there was very little freshness in a corridor lined with portraits and lit by low lamps. She needed only a moment to loosen the invisible grip she kept on her own composure. She had just reached the long window overlooking the south lawn when voices approached from the half-open door behind her. She would have moved away at once had she not heard her own name. "She bears herself well," said one of the ladies, the quieter of the two, "but one never quite knows what to think of these arrangements." Mrs. Ellingford answered in a tone polished smooth by years of social practice. "My dear, one thinks exactly what is proper and says nothing. Ashford has always done as he pleases. If he wishes to install a debtor's daughter under his roof and call it duty, society will permit him the dignity of the fiction." Clara did not move. "Do you suppose there is more to it?" the other voice asked. "There is always more to it when a man rescues a pretty woman," Mrs. Ellingford replied, "especially when he is rich enough to call rescue whatever he likes." The words entered Clara like cold rain through wool, not because they were wholly surprising, but because they confirmed what she had already feared. It did not matter how carefully she spoke, how modestly she dressed, how loyally she attended Lady Beatrice. To the outside world, she would always risk becoming a story told in lowered voices, a woman placed in a powerful man's house under a title elegant enough to protect everyone except herself. She stared out at the dark lawn where moonlight lay in pale strips across the frost, and for one brief, humiliating second, she hated Ashford Hall with all its velvet quiet, and silver service, and whispered arrangements. She hated her father. She hated Lord Harwood, whose name had reached into her life like smoke. Most of all, she hated that the Duke's intervention, however well meant, had not freed her from judgment. It had only changed the room in which judgment waited. "You should not stand in cold corridors without a shawl." Sebastian's voice came from the shadows behind her, low and even, and Clara turned too quickly to hide what was in her face. He had approached without sound, dressed still in black evening clothes, the candlelight catching the clean line of his collar and the severity of his expression. She wondered how much he had heard. Then she realized with sudden certainty that it no longer mattered. "And you," she said, "should not leave half your guests unattended if you mean to preserve the illusion of hospitality." His gaze rested on her a moment, measuring not the words, but what drove them. The guests have been attended to. How fortunate for them. A silence stretched between them. Not empty, not kind. At length he stepped nearer, though still with that careful restraint he always kept, as though distance itself were a promise he would not break without cause. Mrs. Ellingford will not be invited again this season, he said. Clara looked at him sharply. That is hardly necessary. No, he said. It is merely correct. The simplicity of the answer disarmed her more than any dramatic defense could have done. You heard her, Clara said quietly. Enough. Then you know she was not entirely wrong. He did not answer at once, and that, more than contradiction, made her chest tighten. Society, he said at last, is often wrong in elegant sentences. But it will still speak. Yes. And I will be the one it speaks of. His eyes held her steadily. Not alone. There was something in the way he said it that altered the darkness around them. Clara had expected denial, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, he had given her the one thing powerful men rarely offered women caught inside scandal's shadow. Shared consequence. She should have found comfort in that. Instead, she found danger, because comfort from him had begun to feel too possible. She turned away, pressing one hand lightly to the cold window pane. Why did you not defend me in the room? She asked. When she spoke to me like that, why did you let me stand there and answer for myself? His reply came after only a breath. Because I believed you would rather be respected than rescued. Clara closed her eyes. The answer struck her with the unbearable precision of truth. He had seen her clearly enough to wound her by honoring exactly what she most needed. When she opened her eyes again, the frost beyond the glass looked softer, the night less distant, and that frightened her more than insult had. You make everything difficult, she whispered, not bitterly now, but with the weary astonishment of a woman discovering that safety might ask as much courage as danger. For the first time, Sebastian's expression changed in a way she could not mistake. It was not a smile. It was something quieter, rarer, as though a locked door within him had opened not wide, but enough to let light show at its edge. No, Miss Whitmore, he said. I think life did that long before you met me. And because there was no vanity in the words, no attempt to claim her pain as his opportunity, Clara felt her anger loosen by one impossible degree. The man before her remained cold, controlled, and surrounded by power she could never fully trust. Yet beneath all that, she had begun to see something else. Not merely duty, not merely protection, a loneliness so disciplined it had learned to wear authority like armor. And in that corridor lined with portraits of the dead, under the hush of old stone and winter moonlight, Clara understood with a clarity she had not wanted that the Duke of Ashford was no longer only the man who had changed her fate. He was becoming the one person in the house whose silence she had already begun to hear. Later that night, long after the last carriage had rolled away and Ashford Hall had withdrawn once more into its habitual silence, Clara found herself unable to sleep. The conversation in the gallery still moved through her thoughts with a strange and persistent force, as though each word the Duke had spoken had been set somewhere inside her with deliberate care and now refused to be displaced. The fire in her room had burned low. The clock on the mantel had just struck 11. Beyond the tall windows, winter pressed its pale face against the glass. At last she rose, drew a shawl over her shoulders, and stepped into the corridor, telling herself she meant only to walk until her thoughts grew tired enough to let her rest. But her feet carried her toward the library before she had admitted that was where they wished to go. It was the warmest room in the western wing, lined from floor to ceiling with books bound in faded leather and dark cloth, their quiet presence softened by the glow of shaded lamps and a fire kept steadier than most. Clara had come there twice with Lady Beatrice during the week, always in daylight, always under the older woman's dry commentary on bad historians and worse poets. At night it felt like another country. The shadows were longer. The carved shelves rose into darkness. Candlelight lay across the rug in trembling gold. And at the far end of the room, standing beside the writing table with one hand resting against an open ledger, was Sebastian Ashford. He looked up at once, as though he had sensed her before hearing the door. For a moment neither spoke. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the shawl drawn close around her shoulders and returned to her face. It is late, Miss Whitmore, he said. So I have noticed. The answer was quiet, but he heard the restlessness beneath it. He closed the ledger without seeming to realize he had done so. Has something happened? Clara stepped fully into the room and let the door fall shut behind her. No, that is precisely the difficulty. The fire gave a low, shifting sound. Somewhere in the high dark above. Then the house settled into itself. Sebastian waited, not pressing, not rescuing her from what she had clearly come to say. Clara drew a breath. I have been thinking, she said, and I find that every path leads back to the same humiliation. If I had remained with my father, I would have been bartered. If you had not intervened, I might have been ruined under another roof entirely. And now that I am here, I am fed, clothed, spoken to kindly, and still I remain a subject for speculation in drawing rooms where no one knows my heart, and everyone assumes the worst of my circumstances. She took another step toward the fire, the warmth striking her chilled hands. Do you understand what is so unbearable about that? His eyes did not leave her. Tell me. Clara gave a faint, unsteady breath. It is not only that my life was arranged without me. It is that even now, in safety, I am expected to endure it with grace, as though gratitude ought to erase the insult. For the first time since she had entered, something in Sebastian's expression altered, not surprise, but recognition of a wound named correctly. Gratitude, he said quietly, is often demanded most cruelly by those who have already taken too much. The words struck her with such force that she looked at him in silence. He had understood. Not approximately. Not politely. Exactly. Then why? She asked, the restraint in her voice thinning at last. Did you bring me here if not to place me under another burden I did not choose? He stood very still, the firelight moving along the hard line of his cheek, the gray of his eyes deepened by shadow. Because the burden I chose was one I believed I could lessen. You have not lessened it. No, he said, and the candor of it landed between them like a truth too heavy to be softened. Not enough. Clara felt something inside her give way then, not dramatically, not in tears, but in exhaustion. I do not know how to live inside a kindness that feels like a debt, she whispered. I do not know how to accept protection without feeling purchased by it. Sebastian crossed the space between them then, not quickly, not carelessly, but with that same grave restraint he seemed to bring to everything that mattered. He stopped, an arm's length away, nearer than before, near enough that she could see the faint scar at his temple, the weariness hidden beneath his composure, the discipline with which he held himself apart from every impulse that might have made a weaker man presumptuous. Then hear me plainly, he said, his voice low enough that the library itself seemed to lean in and listen. You do not owe me your gratitude. You do not owe me your obedience. You do not owe me your future. I did not bring you here to be indebted to me, Clara. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Not Miss Whitmore. Not with formal distance. Clara. The sound of it moved through her more deeply than it should have, because it carried no possession, only sincerity stripped of title and ceremony. Her breath caught before she could hide it. He seemed to hear that too, because his gaze sharpened with something quieter than tenderness and far more dangerous, because it had been fought for. I brought you here, he continued, because I could not bear the thought of you being delivered to men who would mistake your helplessness for permission. If I have failed to spare you pain, then that failure is mine. But do not ever believe that I wanted your humiliation. I wanted time, safety, a chance for you to stand somewhere the world could not so easily reach. Clara could not speak. The fire burned low behind him. The house was silent. And in that silence, she understood what had remained hidden beneath every careful gesture, every measured word, every refusal to touch or press or claim. Sebastian Ashford had never wanted her dependence. He had wanted her beyond the reach of men who did. And that truth, once seen, altered everything. At last she found her voice, though it came softer than she intended. You speak as though you know that kind of helplessness. A shadow passed through his eyes then, swift and controlled and impossibly old. I know enough of what power can excuse, he said, and enough of what it destroys. He did not explain further. Yet for the first time, Clara did not mistake silence for evasion. It was not that he would not tell her. It was that whatever had shaped him there belonged to a darkness he had survived only by keeping. It named within himself. She looked at him, really looked, and felt the last sharp edge of her resentment shift into something more perilous, something warm and aching and unwilling to remain unnamed. Respect had come first. Then trust had begun in fragments. But this was different. This was the frightening moment when a woman begins to see the heart inside a guarded man and realizes it has been breaking quietly all along. Sebastian, she said before she could stop herself, and the name fell between them like a vow spoken too early. He did not move. Yet something in his face changed, something so slight another person might have missed it. To Clara it felt like the turning of a key. And when he answered, her name was no longer formal either. "You should sleep, Clara," he said, but the gentleness in the words was not dismissal. It was care so carefully contained it had almost become sorrow. She nodded, though neither of them stepped away at once. Outside, the wind moved softly against the old glass. Inside, in the golden hush of the library, the distance between them remained untouched, and yet had somehow vanished. And Clara knew, with a certainty that left no room for retreat, that whatever secret still lived in the Duke's silence, it had not made him cruel. It had made him careful, and that was far more dangerous to her heart. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pewter, and with it came the first crack in the fragile peace Clara had begun to build around herself. She was in Lady Beatrice's sitting room, reading aloud from a volume of essays the older woman claimed to despise, and yet never failed to interrupt with pointed agreement, when the door opened without ceremony and Mrs. Ellis entered with a face, too composed to mean anything good. The housekeeper bowed first to Lady Beatrice, then turned to Clara with a gravity that drained the warmth from the room before a single word had been spoken. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "there is a gentleman below asking to see you." Clara's fingers tightened on the page. She did not need to ask who. The knowledge moved through her at once, cold and immediate, like water poured down the spine. Lady Beatrice lowered her teacup very slowly. "On whose authority was he admitted?" "None, my lady," Mrs. Ellis replied. "He was received in the outer hall only because he gave his name and insisted the matter concerned family." Family. There was no comfort left in that word. Clara rose too quickly and felt the blood leave her face for an instant before steadiness returned. "My father," she said, though it was not a question. Mrs. Ellis inclined her head. "Yes, miss." Silence followed. Outside the tall windows the winter garden lay motionless, pale branches netted against the low sky. Clara had imagined this moment more than once in the nights since arriving at Ashford Hall. In those imaginings she had always been calmer, stronger, armed with sentences sharpened by distance and betrayal. But imagination rarely prepares the body. Her pulse had already begun to pound in a way that made every breath feel borrowed. Lady Beatrice watched her with a gaze so clear it seemed to strip away every polite excuse at once. "You are not obliged to see him," the older woman said. Clara swallowed. "No," she answered softly. "But if I do not, he will return. And if he returns, he will bring with him all the noise this house has spared me." Lady Beatrice's expression hardened, though not at Clara. Noise is the least of what men like that bring. She set aside her cup and reached for her cane. "Still, you will not go down alone." "My lady, that is not necessary." "Which is precisely why it shall be done." But before either woman could move, another voice entered from the doorway behind them, low and perfectly controlled. No, Sebastian Ashford stood there in a dark coat, still carrying the faint chill of the outer corridor, as though he had come from the front of the house at once. His gaze found Clara first, not his aunt, not Mrs. Ellis, and in that one brief look she saw that he had already understood everything that mattered. "You will remain here," he said to her quietly. "I will speak with him." Clara felt the old humiliation rise at once, sharp and instinctive. "He is my father." "Yes. Then I should be present." No, the word was not loud, but it halted the room more completely than any raised voice could have. Sebastian crossed to the hearth, then turned to face her fully. There was no coldness in him now. Something far more dangerous had replaced it. Purpose. "You have already borne the consequences of his decisions," he said. "You will not be made to bear his performance as well." Clara stared at him. "You cannot decide that for me." "No," he said, and the force in his expression softened by 1 degree. "But I can prevent him from using your presence as leverage." That struck too close to truth to dismiss. She hated that. She hated more that he was right. Her father had never needed her tears, only her conscience. Give him one look at her face, and he would know exactly where to place the knife of guilt without ever raising his hand. Lady Beatrice watched them both in silence, her lined face grave with old understanding. At last Clara lifted her chin, the motion small and hard one. "Very well," she said, "but I will hear what he came for." Sebastian inclined his head once. "You shall." Then he turned and left without another word. The room felt emptier the moment he was gone, though not safer. Clara stood where she was, one hand resting against the open book on the table, the printed lines before her swimming into meaninglessness. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was only one. Time had a way of distorting when dread entered a house. No one spoke. Even Lady Beatrice remained still, listening with the focus of a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding what danger sounded like before it had a name. Then, from somewhere below, a voice rose. Not loud enough for words. Only the rough cadence of a man pleading and resenting in equal measure, his tone familiar enough to turn Clara's blood to ice. Her father. She closed her eyes. She could see him without seeing him at all, the worn coat brushed into false decency, the hands restless with need, the face composed into suffering whenever pity might still be useful. Another voice answered, lower, steadier, impossible to make out and impossible to mistake. Sebastian. Clara moved before she had decided to move. She crossed the room, opened the door, and stepped into the corridor with Mrs. Ellis calling softly behind her. The great staircase descended in a sweep of shadow and afternoon light toward the entrance hall below, and from the landing she could see them at last. Her father stood near the open doors, hat in hand, the posture of injured respectability strained over visible desperation. Opposite him, Sebastian faced him with one gloved hand resting lightly behind his back, every line of his body still and controlled. A footman waited near the wall. The butler stood like carved stone. No one interrupted. Clara had never seen power made so silent. "I have come only to speak with my daughter," her father was saying, his voice carrying upward now. "Whatever grievance your grace may hold against me, surely a father is entitled to private concern for his own child." Sebastian did not move. "A father," he said, "is entitled to concern when he has first shown it." Clara stopped midway down the staircase, hidden by the curve of the banister. Her breath caught. Her father's face changed, not into shame, but into offense. "You presume far too much regarding a family matter." "Do I?" Sebastian's tone remained even. "Then let us be precise. You attempted to pledge Miss Whitmore into Lord Harwood's household under conditions you did not disclose to her. You concealed the nature of that arrangement beneath language chosen to preserve your own dignity. You incurred debts in her name of duty and intended to collect them with her future." "I do not presume, sir. I have documentation." Clara gripped the banister so tightly the polished wood bit into her palm through the glove. Below, her father had gone pale beneath the strain of maintaining composure. "These are private negotiations," he said. "They concern no one outside my family. You forfeited the privacy of the matter when you made your daughter the price." The sentence fell through the hall like iron. No servant so much as blinked, yet Clara felt the entire house hear it. Her father opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again with the last weapon left to weak men. "Injury. She is my child." Sebastian's expression did not change. And yet it was necessary for another man to behave as though she were worth protecting. The words should have shattered Clara. Instead they steadied her. For the first time since childhood, she watched her father from a distance great enough to see him clearly, not as the burdened man she had excused, not as the parent whose failures demanded forgiveness, but as a frightened and selfish soul brought at last before someone he could neither charm nor shame. He looked smaller than she remembered, smaller and suddenly old. Then his gaze lifted and found her on the staircase. Everything in his face altered at once. "Clara," he said, and there it was, the wounded tenderness he had always worn whenever he needed something only she could be made to give. "My dear girl, tell him this has gone too far." She did not descend another step. Clara remained where she was, one gloved hand closed around the banister, the polished wood cold beneath her palm. Below her, her father stood in the entrance hall with his face turned upward in that familiar appeal she had once mistaken for love, and for the first time in her life, she felt no rush to soothe him. No instinct rose to descend the staircase, to defend him, to gather his dignity back into trembling hands and call it filial mercy. Something within her had gone still at last. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. No, she said. The word was not loud, yet it carried through the hall with such clean certainty that even the air seemed to sharpen around it. Her father stared as though he had not understood. Clara, he said again, with a strained tenderness that would once have undone her, you do not know what has been said to poison you against me. She took one step downward then, and only one, enough that the winter light from the open doors could touch her face. I know what was hidden from me, she answered. I know what was arranged in my name without my knowledge. I know that every debt you could not bear became a burden you expected me to carry in silence. That is not poison. It is memory. A flush rose along his cheeks, not from shame, but from the injury of being seen too accurately. I did what I had to do, he said. A man in desperate circumstances cannot always choose the gentlest remedy. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she saw the entire shape of her former life with a sharpness almost merciful in its completeness. All the small sacrifices asked of her because she was dutiful, all the apologies made on his behalf because he was tired, all the ways he had mistaken her capacity to endure for an endless resource placed in his hands. By right, you did not choose the gentlest remedy, she said quietly. You chose the one that cost you least. The silence that followed was deeper than any raised voice. Sebastian had not moved. He stood a few feet from her father, grave and still, allowing the truth to belong to her now that she had spoken it. That, more than anything, gave her strength. He was not rescuing her from this moment. He was holding the world still long enough for her to stand inside it without being overrun. Her father glanced between them then, and Clara watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, that whatever power he had once exercised through her conscience no longer answered to him. Desperation altered his expression at once. You cannot mean to remain here, he said. In another man's house, under another man's protection, while your own father is treated like a criminal at the door. Clara's heart beat hard once, but the old guilt did not rise to meet it. I remain nowhere against my will now, she replied. That is the difference. Sebastian's gaze flickered toward her then, brief and unreadable, yet Clara felt in it the force of a promise honored. Her father turned sharply toward the Duke. So this was the plan, he said bitterly. To turn her against me until she speaks with your voice instead of mine. No, Sebastian answered, calm as winter stone. The plan was to ensure that when she spoke, it would finally be with her own. The words passed through Clara like a bell struck in some long-abandoned chapel. She had not known until that instant how much she had needed to hear them. Not because they praised her, because they returned something. Something taken so slowly she had not realized it was missing until it was placed back into her hands. Her father seemed to recognize the same thing, and it frightened him. He took a step forward, stopped only by the quiet shift of the footman at the wall, and then, seeing the uselessness of anger, reached instead for pleading once more. Clara, he said, his voice breaking now under the strain of real fear, come home. Whatever has happened, whatever was misunderstood, we can mend it together. Home. The word should have carried warmth. Instead it sounded like a room with no lock on the door and no place in it that belonged to her. Clara descended the remaining steps slowly, each one measured, until she stood upon the marble floor not beside her father, but across from him. She could feel Sebastian near enough to intervene if needed, far enough not to overshadow her choice. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. There is no home for me in the life you intended, she said. Not anymore. Her father looked at her, as though he had lost something he still believed was his. Then what do you intend? She turned then, not first to Sebastian, but to the small table near the hall wall where several papers had been set down beside a silver tray. She had noticed them only in passing when she came down the stairs, but now Sebastian moved to them, took the uppermost document, and held it a moment before offering it to her. Clara hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The paper was thick, the seal precise, the language formal enough that the meaning took one stunned moment to reach her fully. It was a legal release, not from service within the house alone, but from any contractual obligation tied to her father's debts, her residence at Ashford Hall, or any claim made on her future through either. A complete discharge. An end. She looked up, unable for a second to speak. Sebastian met her gaze with that same grave steadiness she had come to know, but now there was something else beneath it, something quieter and infinitely more vulnerable, because it was given without protection. It was prepared this morning, he said. The accounts have been concluded. Your father no longer holds any debt that can be transferred to you, directly or by arrangement. Nor do I. Clara stared at him. The words rang through her with such force that the hall, the servants, her father, the winter light on the marble, all seemed to fall away from the center of her thoughts. Nor do I. He had done what powerful men almost never did when affection and authority stood in the same room. He had opened his hand. Her father saw the paper and blanched. You would release her, he said, disbelief stripping the polish from his voice. After all this? Yes, Sebastian said. She was never mine to keep. Clara looked down at the document again, her vision blurring for one dangerous instant before clearing. Every humiliation, every fear, every strange comfort of the past weeks had led not to possession, but to this. Freedom placed in her hands with no condition attached. No bargain. No plea. No demand for gratitude. Her fingers trembled very slightly against the edge of the page. If you wish to leave Ashford Hall, Sebastian said, and now his voice was lower, meant for her even in the presence of others. You may do so with my carriage, my staff, and enough money to make any next step you choose without dependence on any man. If you wish to remain for a time as Lady Beatrice's companion, you may remain as a paid member of her household, under terms written in your favor and yours alone. If you wish never to see me again after this day, that also is your right. He stopped there, though Clara felt the silence fill with what he did not say. That none of those choices would be easy for him. That the hardest thing he had ever offered might be the freedom to walk away. Her father made a sound of outrage, but it reached her now as though from a great distance. Clara folded the document carefully, not because her hands were fully steady, but because the gesture itself felt like reverence for something she had never before possessed. Choice. Then she lifted her eyes to Sebastian's face. In all the great, cold beauty of Ashford Hall, nothing had ever seemed more astonishing than the restraint with which he stood before her, loving her perhaps, wanting perhaps, and yet asking nothing. And Clara understood, with a certainty so clear it almost hurt, that whatever happened after this day, she would never again mistake protection for ownership. Because the first man who had truly seen her worth had also been the first to place her future back in her own hands. 3 days later, Clara Whitmore left Ashford Hall in the Duke's carriage with her freedom papers folded inside her reticule and a silence in her chest so deep it seemed to have swallowed even grief. No one stopped her. That, more than anything, made the leaving ache. Lady Beatrice kissed her cheek and declared that independence was a vulgar habit in young women, but preferable to foolishness. Mrs. Ellis pressed gloves into her hands and pretended not to notice when Clara's fingers trembled. Sebastian did not ask her to stay. He stood beneath the great stone portico in the gray light of morning, one hand gloved, his face composed with such terrible dignity that it seemed an act of mercy and punishment at once. You have an address in Bath, he said, as though discussing whether rather than the breaking open of both their lives. The house belongs to an old friend of my aunt. You may remain there as long as you wish. No one will trouble you. Clara had looked at him then, really looked, and thought that the hardest cruelty fate had ever offered her was not being unloved, but being loved by a man too honorable to turn love into a chain. Thank you, she had said, because there are moments when language is too small for the truth and gratitude becomes the only fragment one can carry. Then she had stepped into the carriage and left him standing in the cold. Bath was kinder than she expected and lonelier than she feared. The little house on a quiet crescent was warm, tasteful, and entirely her own, with blue curtains, a small writing room, and a narrow garden already showing the first brave signs of spring. For the first time in her life, Clara woke in a place where no one could bargain with her future while she slept. No one watched her plate to measure cost. No one spoke of sacrifice as though it were the natural duty of the less powerful. She bought her own gloves. She chose her own books. She walked where she pleased beneath a sky that seemed wider because it asked nothing of her. It should have been enough. In one sense, it was everything. And yet freedom, once gained, has a way of revealing what the heart has chosen even while the mind still names it danger. By the 5th day, she missed Lady Beatrice's merciless opinions on literature. By the 6th, she missed the hush of Ashford Hall at dusk, the amber firelight on dark paneling, the solemn beauty of rooms that had once frightened her. By the seventh, she stopped pretending it was the house she missed. It was the man who had moved through that great silence like a promise he refused to speak aloud. The man who had seen her humiliation and not used it. The man who had held power in his hands and opened them. On the eighth morning, Clara unfolded the freedom papers again and read them slowly beside the window while spring rain touched the glass in soft gray threads. At the bottom of the final page, beneath the signatures and seals, Sebastian's hand had added a line that was not required by law and therefore meant more than law ever could. No debt remains between us. You are answerable only to yourself. Clara read it once, then again, and with each reading the same truth rose more clearly, until at last it stood before her impossible to deny. She had not left Ashford Hall to escape him. She had left in order to know whether what drew her back would be dependence or choice. It was choice. It was wholly, terrifyingly, beautifully choice. By noon she was on the road again. The sky had cleared by the time the carriage turned through the gates of Ashford Hall, and the stone front of the house stood bright beneath a pale wash of afternoon sun. Clara's pulse had never been so steady or so wild. She stepped down before the servant could offer his hand and crossed the drive with her skirts stirring around her ankles, carrying no fear now except the ancient one that lives in every honest heart. What if she had returned too late? What if freedom had come just in time to teach her loss? But Sebastian was there. He emerged from the west door as if the house itself had given him back to her, dressed in black, grave as ever, though something in his face changed the moment he saw her. It was not surprise alone. It was disbelief held rigidly in check by hope too long denied the right to breathe. For one moment neither moved. Then Clara closed the remaining distance between them and stopped only when propriety demanded it, though every beat of her heart urged her nearer. "I have come back," she said, and the words, simple as they were, seemed to alter the very air between them. He looked at her as though all the discipline in his body had become the only thing preventing him from reaching for something sacred. "You were not expected," he said, but his voice had changed. It had lost some hidden armor she had not known he wore. Clara held his gaze. "No," she answered softly. "I suppose that is what makes it mine." Silence followed, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the stillness of two lives arriving at the same truth from opposite roads. Sebastian's eyes moved over her face with a depth of feeling he no longer seemed willing to hide behind courtesy, and when he spoke again, each word carried the weight of everything he had withheld. "You are free to leave again whenever you wish." Clara felt the old ache and the new peace meet within her like light entering a dark chapel. "I know," she said. "That is why I am here." Something broke then, not in ruin, but in release. He stepped toward her at last, only one pace. Careful even now, careful always, and yet the world seemed to narrow around that single motion until there was nothing in it but the quiet force of a man who had loved without claiming and the woman who had finally returned not because she must, but because she chose him. He did not touch her immediately. Even then he gave her the dignity of the final inch. Clara crossed it herself. Her hand rose to rest lightly against the sleeve of his coat, and beneath the fine dark wool she felt the strength in him go unsteady for one human, unguarded second. It was enough. More than enough. Sebastian lowered his head, not in conquest, not in triumph, but with the reverence of a man receiving what he had not dared to ask for. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice held more wonder than she thought any title in England had ever carried. "If you remain, it must be as nothing less than honored, equal, and entirely free." Tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable gentleness of hearing love speak in the language of respect. She smiled then, small and trembling and true. "Then I shall remain," she whispered. "Exactly so." Behind them, somewhere inside the house, Lady Beatrice's cane struck the floor once in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction, but Clara scarcely heard it. The world had gone quiet in the best possible way. Not empty, not cold, quiet like snow over troubled ground, quiet like the first breath after grief, quiet like two wounded hearts recognizing, at last, that love was never meant to imprison what it healed. And as Sebastian drew her hand fully into his, not as a master takes possession, But as a man receives a gift he will spend the rest of his life proving worthy of, Clara understood the simplest and rarest truth of all. Some women are rescued from ruin. But the blessed ones are given something greater than rescue. They are given the right to choose the hands in which their hearts begin again.